I've worked for the railroad for almost 6 years. Most people assume the job is exciting, but honestly, about 90% of it is routine. I work the overnight cleaning crew, which means once the last commuters are gone, my team boards the trains before they're sent back into service the next morning. If you've ever left a coffee cup or backpack on a train, there's a good chance I was the one who found it. This happened last November, and it's the only reason I requested to never work the night shift alone again. It was around 1:30 in the morning when dispatch sent me to clean a 6-car commuter train that had just been pulled into one of our storage tracks. The train had already been cleared by security, and the conductor signed off that every passenger was off before it entered the yard. That's standard procedure. I started at the front of the train like I always did. The first 2 cars were exactly what you'd expect after a Friday night. Empty bottles, newspapers, food wrappers, nothing unusual. By the 3rd car, I noticed something that caught me off guard. There was a phone lying on one of the seats. That wasn't strange by itself. People forget phones all the time. What was strange was that it was unlocked. The screen was still on. It was sitting upright against the window like someone had only just put it down. I picked it up, expecting to see a missed call or emergency contact. Instead, the camera app was open. The screen was pointed toward the aisle. I remember joking to myself that someone must have been filming a TikTok before they got off. I slipped it into the lost and found pouch on my cart and kept working. About 20 seconds later, I heard a seat slam upright behind me. Those seats can fold down if someone leaves them that way, but they don't usually spring back on their own. I turned around. Nothing. Every row looked normal. I figured maybe I'd bumped something with the cart. Still, I didn't remember walking close enough. I shrugged it off. The 4th car was completely empty, too empty. Usually there's at least a forgotten jacket or drink somewhere. This one looked almost untouched. As I vacuumed the aisle, I noticed the floor was wet near one of the doors. Not soaked, just a few footprints. They looked fresh. I checked outside the train expecting rain, but the yard was completely dry. No puddles. No recent storm. I remember thinking another employee must have walked through earlier. The footprints stopped halfway down the aisle. There weren't any leading back. That bothered me more than it should have. I finished that car faster than usual. When I stepped into the 5th car, my radio crackled. "Everything good?" It was my supervisor. "Yeah," I answered. "Just about done." He laughed. "You're moving fast tonight." I looked at my watch. I'd only been inside for 11 minutes. It felt like half an hour. We ended the call, and I got back to work. As I reached the rear of the car, I heard 3 knocks. Not on the train. On the window beside me. I nearly dropped my flashlight. Outside was nothing but another empty track. There shouldn't have been anyone walking around this part of the yard without reflective gear. I shined my light through the glass. Nothing. I even stepped closer. Still nothing. I convinced myself it was probably metal contracting from the cold. It was almost freezing outside. I started toward the last car. Halfway through the connecting door, my radio went off again. Except this time nobody spoke. All I heard was breathing. Slow. Steady. I said, "Hello?" Nothing. Just breathing. Then the transmission ended. I figured someone had accidentally leaned on their radio. It happens. The last car took less than 2 minutes. As I was collecting trash, I realized something. The lost and found pouch on my cart was unzipped. The phone I'd picked up earlier was gone. I stopped cold. I knew I'd put it there. I checked every pocket on the cart. Nothing. Maybe I'd left it back in the 3rd car. Annoying, but not impossible. I walked back through the train to look for it. When I reached the 3rd car, the phone was exactly where I'd first found it. Same seat. Same position. Camera still open. This time I picked it up more carefully. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The camera wasn't pointed at the aisle anymore. It was pointed toward the rear door. I frowned. Maybe I'd remembered wrong. Then I saw the recording timer. The phone had been recording video for almost 23 minutes, long before I ever boarded the train. Curious, I played the last few seconds. At first, it was just an empty train car. Then, right before the video ended, someone walked into frame. Not from the platform, from the door connecting to the next car. The person wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low. They stopped in the aisle, looked directly into the camera, then reached forward, and the recording ended. I stared at the screen for a second before looking through the window into the next car. Empty. I told myself someone must have hidden on the train after security cleared it. That thought alone was enough to make me radio dispatch. Before they answered, I heard a metallic clang somewhere behind me. Not loud, just enough to echo through the empty train. It came from the last car. I didn't wait around. I got off the train and met security at the platform. They searched every single car, every storage compartment, every restroom, the roof, even underneath. Nobody was found. I handed over the phone. A few days later, I asked one of the security supervisors if they'd figured out whose it was. He got quiet. Then he told me something that still bothers me. The phone wasn't registered to any passenger who'd ridden that train that night. In fact, it had been reported missing almost 8 months earlier. The owner disappeared after boarding the very same train line. They never found him. I still clean trains for a living, but now before I step into an empty car, I always check to make sure I'm actually alone. About 2 years ago, I started taking the last commuter train home after my warehouse shift. It wasn't ideal, but it beat paying for ride shares every night. After a few months, I knew almost every regular who rode that train, the same security guard, the same college kid asleep with headphones on, the same older guy reading newspapers he'd already finished hours earlier. One Thursday night, though, almost nobody showed up. There were maybe 8 passengers spread across 3 train cars. I remember checking the weather because I figured people had stayed home because of the rain. It wasn't raining. The train left on time, and everything felt normal for the first 10 minutes. Then, right before we entered a long tunnel between stations, the brakes hit hard. Hard enough that everyone lurched forward. The train stopped completely. Nobody seemed too worried at first. Mechanical delays happen all the time. The conductor came over the speaker. "Sorry about that, folks. We should be moving again shortly." His voice sounded calm enough. People pulled out their phones. I did the same. No signal. Again, not unusual inside a tunnel. About a minute later, I noticed something outside my window. At first, I thought it was one of the maintenance workers. There was someone walking alongside the train. That immediately struck me as odd. Maintenance crews usually wear reflective jackets and carry lights. This person had neither, just dark clothes, hands in their pockets, walking slowly toward the front of the train. I watched until they disappeared into the darkness. A woman sitting across from me noticed too. She asked if I'd seen him. I nodded. She shrugged and went back to scrolling through photos on her phone. A few seconds later, another announcement came over the speakers. This time, the conductor sounded different. His voice was lower, almost rushed. "If anyone sees someone outside the train, do not open any doors." That got everyone's attention. Someone laughed nervously and said, "Why would anyone open the door?" Nobody answered. The lights flickered once, then stayed on. 5 more minutes passed. The tunnel was dead silent. No train noise, no announcements, nothing. Then there was a knock, 3 quick taps, not inside the train. On the outside of the window, everyone in my section looked over at the same time. There was nobody there. I actually stood up and leaned toward the glass. Nothing but darkness. The older man across the aisle quietly said, "Sit down." I asked him if he'd seen who knocked. He didn't answer. He just kept staring out the opposite window. About 30 seconds later, Another passenger walked into our car from the one behind us. He looked shaken. He asked if anyone else had seen someone trying the emergency door. Nobody said anything. He repeated himself. I swear someone was pulling on it. One of the other passengers rolled their eyes and said it was probably the train settling. The guy shook his head. No, the handle moved. That was enough to make everyone uncomfortable. The conductor came over the speakers again. If anyone is between train cars, return to your seat immediately. Nobody had left their seat. At least not in our car. I remember thinking maybe someone else farther back was messing around. Then we heard footsteps. Running. Not outside. On the roof. They started near the front of the train, heavy, fast. Crossing one car after another. Everyone froze. You could actually hear the metal flexing overhead. The footsteps reached our car, stopped. Complete silence. I looked up instinctively. Then came one loud metallic bang directly above us. A woman screamed. Almost immediately the train lurched forward. The lights returned to full brightness. The tunnel ended less than 30 seconds later. When we reached the next station, transit police were waiting. They searched every car, every roof, every space underneath. Nothing. We all gave statements before we were allowed to leave. About a week later, I saw an article online about someone being arrested for trespassing in rail tunnels near that section of track. I figured that explained everything. Until I talked to one of the transit officers I'd met that night. He remembered me. I asked if they'd caught the guy who'd been on our train. He looked confused. Then he said something I still think about. There wasn't anyone on the train. I reminded him about the person walking beside it, the footsteps, the emergency door. He nodded. We checked every security camera in that tunnel. I asked what they found. He paused for a second. The cameras never showed anyone. I still ride that line every now and then. Whenever the train slows down before entering that tunnel, I always move to the middle of the car, away from the doors. My uncle worked for a freight railroad for almost 30 years. He's not the type of person who tells exaggerated stories. In fact, getting him to talk about work at all is nearly impossible. A few months ago, we were helping my grandfather clean out his garage when we found an old railroad lantern. That somehow led to the only story I've ever heard him tell about his job. According to him, it happened in the late 90s. His crew was sent to inspect an abandoned siding that hadn't been used in years. The railroad planned to reopen it for storage, so they had to make sure the tracks were still safe. There were 4 of them altogether. They drove a maintenance truck down the service road and parked about half a mile from the old line. The tracks disappeared into a heavily wooded area. Everything looked untouched. The inspection started normally. They checked rails, measured ties, photographed damaged sections. Nothing unusual. About 20 minutes in, one of the guys found fresh boot prints crossing the tracks. That was strange. The nearest public road was miles away. The prints came out of the woods, crossed the rails, then disappeared back into the trees. Nobody thought much of it. Hunters wandered onto railroad property all the time. They kept working. Another 15 minutes passed before they found something else. A folding chair, sitting beside the tracks, perfectly upright. No campfire, no cooler, no trash. Just a chair facing the rails. One of the crew joked that somebody liked watching trains that hadn't run in years. They laughed and kept moving. A few hundred yards later, my uncle heard metal hit metal. Clang. It sounded like someone striking the rail with a hammer. They stopped. Waited. Nothing. The foreman called out. No answer. The sound came again, this time farther down the track. They assumed another maintenance crew had started working from the opposite end. The foreman radioed dispatch to ask if anyone else had been assigned there. The answer came back almost immediately. No other crews in the area. That made everyone uneasy. They continued anyway. As they rounded a bend, they noticed something lying between the rails. It was one of those orange safety flags railroad crews use during inspections. The problem was, it belonged to them. One of the workers checked his equipment bag. His flag was missing. Nobody remembered dropping it. The nearest person would have had to walk past all four of them to place it there. Nobody had seen anyone. The foreman picked it up. They continued another 100 yards before hearing the clang again. Closer, almost behind them. Everyone turned. The tracks were empty. The woods were silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. The foreman finally decided they'd seen enough. He told everyone they were heading back. As they walked toward the truck, my uncle noticed fresh footprints in the gravel beside the tracks. They weren't there earlier. They matched the same tread pattern they'd found at the beginning of the inspection. Someone had been walking behind them, keeping pace, without ever being seen. Nobody said anything until they reached the truck. The atmosphere had completely changed. They loaded their equipment as quickly as they could. Just before climbing inside, my uncle looked back one last time. The folding chair was gone. He assumed someone had picked it up. Then he realized something. The chair had been sitting in soft gravel. If someone had carried it away, there should have been footprints. There weren't any. Only the same single set of boot prints, leading toward the tracks, not away from them. The railroad police searched the area later that afternoon. They never found anyone. The official report listed the incident as possible trespassing. Case closed. Years later, after my uncle retired, he requested copies of the inspection photos from that day. He said he only wanted them because he missed working on the railroad. Most of the pictures were exactly as he remembered, except one. Near the edge of the frame, almost hidden behind a tree, was part of someone's leg, just below the knee, blue jeans, work boots. The person had been standing there while the picture was taken. Nobody on his crew was wearing blue jeans that day. And according to the timestamp, the photo was taken nearly 10 minutes before they found the first set of footprints.